Hi, everyone. My name is Suzanne Grossman. I direct career services at the Marxe School of Public and International Affairs, here with my colleague, Assistant Director Samantha Bruno. We do have over 50 people RSVP'd for today, so we imagine more people will join us, or perhaps they're just going to wait for the recording, but thank you for being with us. We are going to get started to be respectful of time, and like I said, hopefully more people will join us. But I'm going to introduce Carmen Perez, who is the founder and partner of Better Next, where she leads social impact special projects for companies. She is going to go into some more detail about her background for you. And we're excited to have her here. She reached out to us and was interested in sharing more about her area of expertise in the ESG space. We know a lot of you are curious or interested in this space. And so I'm going to turn it over to Carmen, and then she's going to also allow plenty of time for question and answer at the end. So Carmen, thanks again for being here.
Thank you so much for having me, and thanks everybody for joining. I have some slides just to kind of organize some thoughts. So some of it is just about what is now commonly called ESG field, but I'm going to try to take it in the direction of what I think connects to people looking for career pathways in corporate responsibility. So I wanted to just introduce myself, take a minute to have everybody type in the chat just to get conversation going, because hopefully we can keep this interactive, answer the questions that are on your mind, and then just talk about the industry as a whole. And then my specific background and expertise is in social impact, or the S in ESG. So a little bit about those issues. And in particular, I lean in the direction of measurement and data. So can dig into that as much as people are interested. I've got a couple company examples, and then just want to offer my point of view on what I see happening with careers around ESG right now. So that is the lay of the land of what I wanted to do with our time together. So before I dive into my introduction, I just want to ask everybody to open up the chat box. So I think that's enabled for everybody. And you can either just write why you joined today. Could be any number of reasons, be totally honest. Or if you have a question that you really want to make sure to get answered, please type that in. So I'll start doing my intro once I see at least one chat, just so I know y'all can hear me and that we're all together here. So as Suzanne said, my name is Carmen Perez. I'm founder and partner of Better Next. I'm recently self-employed. Recent, if you think 1 year is recent. I still feel fairly new at it. And before I was self-employed, I worked at a place called Chief Executives for Corporate Purpose. So it was a corporate coalition, primarily large companies. There were over 200 companies in our network, and they were all focused on how the company could sort of expand and increase and have better results with their social impact programs. So way back in time when CECP was founded, it was more than 20 years ago, it was pretty much exclusively around philanthropy, how companies sort of had their foray into social impact. And I would say now, depending on the company, that looks a lot different, and it goes much beyond just transactional grant-making relationships with maybe one person inside the company focused on that. My role at CECP was all about research. It was about benchmarking. We being the team, I was leading the data insights team, a bunch of different papers on what was changing in the corporate social impact field, leaning in the direction of providing companies guidance on metrics. So it was a really great place to be, and I learned a lot. And it was a smaller organization, about 20 people, so you could really sort of dig into a lot of different areas. Another thing I did at CECP was launch our global exchange. So we essentially found CECP-esque organizations, similar missions, always a little bit different, around the world in major economies around the world, and would compare notes, cross-pollinate trends that were happening in our domestic marketplaces. And so there was so much value to all that was happening with that global exchange. So that was really exciting. And I mention it because I know there might be some folks with international leans in their MPA programs. Before that, my career story was all in the nonprofit sector. So I also have an MPA. I went to Wagner and did 1 year with the city, the Department of Consumer Affairs. So I dipped my toe into government, city agencies before working mostly in like economic development, domestic microfinance. And in particular, I worked with one nonprofit in Western Queens, and it was a whole model of workforce development and financial counseling and different things, but I was responsible to help open up a credit union. So I'm giving a longer introduction than I might otherwise, just in case anything from my background is sort of sparking an area that you might want to talk about or dig into a little bit more. So I'm just going to scan these chats. Misconceptions about the S and ESG. Sandra, you're leading a fellowship program for emerging fund managers in social impact funds. Okay, so there could be some interesting perspective that I can offer on that front. The career options in the field, I've got something on that. Catherine and Lindsay, new to the field, so cutting through the jargon. I hear you on that. ESG itself, to some people, is jargon. Okay, awesome. And just interested in learning more about the field. Okay, I think we can do all those things. So my personal preference and style is for everyone to feel like they can ask a question at any point. So you can go off mute if you're so inclined. You can type it in the chat, you can raise your hand, but certainly feel free to ask a question in whatever way feels good for you. I'm going to dive into my slides now. Is that okay, Suzanne and Sam? Thumbs up? Okay. All right, so let's talk a little bit about ESG. So the term ESG is basically the in vogue term for a field which has existed for a really long time. In the bottom left, I've got sort of terms that I consider related to ESG. The origin of the term ESG comes from investors, as many of you probably know, but that was decades ago, and it was very niche. It was like a certain group of investors who were like, we want data other than finance. But from that point and to where we are today, right now, it has really caught a lot of attention. I think because people believe that the decisions that investors are making are one of the most influential places to really move the needle in corporate behavior. So at the top, it's the debate about what does it mean to be a capitalist? How should companies act? How should they make decisions? And is it just about profit, or is it about more? What other responsibilities do they have? So some people will say, if you use the term corporate social responsibility, that's outdated. Some people will say, you know, ESG is a new greenwashing and all of that. So to me, it's always about the substance. The term only gives you sort of the general direction of where someone's thinking, or even where a job posting might look. You know, it's really about the substance. It's always going to require you to go one step deeper to see what someone is really talking about. There's companies who are very holistic in ESG strategy. It really is like an integrated way that they're, you know, reorienting their decision making, and others have a foundation and they just changed the name to ESG. So it's always going to take a second to kind of like dig in and see what they're really all about. Purpose-driven business is another term that I think is not new, but it might be another place that the field lands, as there's more criticism of the term ESG in general. And then the other is something which is a nod to stakeholder capitalism, which I don't know if that has come up in any classwork that you've been doing. So that's a little bit of commentary about the terminology, and that ESG is a field in and of itself, but as the terms have shifted, even over like the past decade, I would say that understanding the substance of the work is even more the crux of it all. And that corporate social responsibility is really sort of the origins of where the ESG field is today. So if you are looking in these types of roles or you're in one already, I think another thing is just the lens through which different people look at these issues. So the biggest angle for CEO audiences is about long-term planning. My commentary is, I was about to say, unfortunately, investors focus only on risk assessment. That's commentary, but investors focus on risk assessment primarily. So they want to say, which social issues are a risk to us, which environmental issues are a risk to us, and look at it through that. And then for anybody with a communications lean, you're probably most interested in the consumer point of view, which is about finding good companies, looking at purchases through ethics, are you making the right choice in terms of how you're spending money? And then I would say that the strongest voice that has, pushed more corporate action in recent years is the employee voice. So employees trust their employers the most across all sectors, government, specifically their employer, I would say, not the corporate sector as a whole. But then likewise, they're also the major source of like what's causing some strife inside companies to make different decisions about what they're doing. That's important because if you're interested in ESG, you're probably interested in seeing negative things get better, and connecting to employees as a major driving force of that, I think, is really important. One other thing that I feel is important to think about is just that, ESG is really the beginning of a phrase. It always has to have something to describe sort of what are you really talking about. So if you're saying ESG strategy, it's about business strategy. Knowing that many of you are in the MPA track, I figured ESG reporting might be one of the biggest topics of interest, because reporting and regulation and public sector and policy are all sort of intertwined. And likewise, the reporting is very commonly connected to investors. So that's just a thought, even in interviews or cover letter writing, to think about, ESG itself is not a thing. It's the ESG field, it's ESG issues, metrics, reporting, et cetera. Okay, so then I realize now I didn't actually expand my slides. Let me do this. I don't know if that bothers anybody. We just see one at a time now. Okay, so lately, what are some really big components of the industry which are rising and where there's probably a lot of career opportunities? Investors, even from like high net worth individuals all the way up to like the major asset holders like BlackRock, are looking for what they'll call ESG investments. They used to probably call them socially responsible investments or other things. So the amount of assets that are trying to move towards better investments is really massive right now. That's causing all kinds of issues. There aren't necessarily that many places for that money to go, but it's a major field. And someone mentioned that they were thinking a fund that might be sort of connected to that and have some more specific thoughts or questions on it. And then also reporting. So any large company, any publicly traded company is reporting on whatever term they like: CSR report, sustainability report, ESG report. Some they lean European non-financial data report. So it's just assumed. And so any company that you might be trying to work for, pulling up that report and just seeing what are they talking about, what are they focused on, can be something that's really crucial. And similarly, so many places are hiring people to help them with reporting. So that's about writing, that's about collecting data, internal comms, because you have to get connections with all kinds of other people inside the company. And then the third big movement, which probably some of you have been reading about, is at the regulatory level. The SEC in the US is primarily focused on drawing conclusions from SASB. Is anybody familiar with SASB? I'm seeing a nod. So SASB, Sustainability Accounting Standards Board, they are very investor focused. So in my opinion, their assessment of which issues are material or which issues are critical probably don't really represent what employees or customers or communities would say, but they're a great step forward for sustainability reporting, and the SEC is focused on them. And then at the global level, there's also a process, and you could actually write a public comment right now if you want to, on some general disclosures and climate related disclosures, which will become required and standards written at the global level, similar to what happened with when they tried to regulate financial reporting 100 years ago or whenever that came into play. That means lots of new jobs and also all kinds of commentary, risks, opportunities to how those regulations are being written. So as I said, I thought reporting might be of particular interest, knowing that a lot of folks are on the MPA track. The little table on the left is not my creation. And I couldn't find the source, but I used it in the past presentation. But these are the major places, like lots of standards. Some consider Dow Jones Sustainability Index a rater or a ranker, not really a standard. It'll be interesting to see how the relevance of these groups evolve as the reporting environment becomes more regulated and more the norm. I put on there the big four. The other place there's major hiring booms, which you've probably seen, are EY, Deloitte, KPMG, and I always forget one of the big four accounting firms. They are staffing up, making major investments, major investments to build these teams, because assurance is going to be like the next frontier for accounting, assurance of ESG data. So the other place that I think is like interesting from a career point of view, like if you ultimately wanted to lead social impact inside a company, for example, one way to get experience is actually something similar. I worked at CECP, a corporate coalition, and there's lots of them out there. I listed a few of my favorites: World Business Council for Sustainable Development, they're global. Just Capital, they're not really a corporate coalition, but they do really cool research. So they're an awesome place to look. Project Drawdown, they do climate related research and it's amazing, but they also are growing this component called Drawdown Labs, which is where the research is supposed to, like, the rubber hits the road with corporate coalitions. And then I listed a few more consulting type of places, like Ceres is the place that did the first ever sustainability report. Corporate Citizenship is another big consultancy in reporting, Arabella Advisors, FSG. The last two lean a little bit more like nonprofit sector, but really great places that are serving companies, serving nonprofits, social sector, and a great place to build up some experience, I would say. And if you're not, I would also suggest following 3BL Media, because every company that puts out a CSR sustainability report reports it there, big announcements go through there. So it's this nice hub of ESG or social impact or social responsibility news. So I've been talking a lot. I want to pause. Does anybody want to ask a question out loud? Just going to scan the chat. Don't be shy.
I have just a super general question.
Yeah.
It is the goal of a lot of these in the chart on the left-hand side with the different reporting initiatives. For most of them, is the goal that eventually that the governments will take these on, like they'll transfer it from nonprofit or civil society thing to like what's happening with the SEC and climate, maybe. And if that's the case, like, is this kind of work also going to be happening in different government agencies, or do you see it really staying in, being on the, the auditing and side of it will stay in the private sector?
Mm-hmm. That's a great question. And I think the answer will depend on who you ask, because anybody who leans in the direction of like public policy as the major force for change will want to stop these sort of independent organizations and have everything move to something which is regulated. What I would point out is that it hasn't been regulated, and in the US, what were those numbers? They were well above 80% were reporting this type of information. And so that to me is a signal that the market is developing. So the criticism of it is that companies are sort of like choosing what they want to report. And on the environmental side, that's problematic because there is like true science behind it. You can like look at these different units of measure and say, do we have too much? Do we have too little? Are we in the right balance? And what has been your effect on it? So I do see a really big role for regulation, particularly on the climate side. And that's from my measurement mind because it's more scientific. On the social impact side, in my opinion, we need more time for companies to report individually because the power balance is so off. It's so driven by boards and investors. In the social reporting, there aren't enough companies yet that have really looked at critically, like, let's talk about our effects on social issues, our positive contributions to reversing those or making some positive change. There's some real bright spots out there, companies that are doing good things and good reporting, but to me, standardization happens once you know you have the right answer, then you should standardize it. In the social impact side, I would personally be motivated by seeing more years of companies individually reporting with like pressure from employees and customers and communities to say like, you have to tell us more, you know? So that would be my answer.
That's super interesting. Thank you.
Anybody else have a comment? Also have a comment, doesn't have to be a question, or share your own experience. Who was the person? You may have stepped away. I want to find the person who was launching. Sandra. Fund managers. She might not be on the line, but Sandra, please feel free to chime in if you have any thoughts in particular on like the connections to how the way money moves has an influence here.
Yeah, I think that's something that we're seeing a lot with our fellows is when it comes to like launching these funds where you know that the capital deployed is going to have a significant impact. A lot of the time it's difficult to pitch concessionary funds to traditional investors. And so the pool of potential investors is kind of narrow to, you know, family offices or foundations, which obviously because they're comfortable with receiving, you know, receiving minimal returns on their investment. Usually they're not providing the kind of capital that is needed to sustain the fund long term. So it's been a little bit of a difficulty, a hurdle to overcome.
I think that's really true. And hopefully, you know, at this moment in time when so many people are trying to move money, they also will adjust their requirements and expectations connected to that. Okay, awesome. All right, so then this is just to shift a little bit more to social issues, social impact, S and ESG. This is a corporate investor perspective, but I think we'll get towards your question, Eve, about supporting culture and arts. So the way, this is a paper that we did while I was at CECP, and it was about what counts, the S and ESG. And when companies, if we had to look like across the whole corporate sector, regardless of industry, and say, what is included within social issues or social impact, the way that we expressed it in like the briefest way was to first divide it between internal and external, and then to list the issues that you're seeing right now. So externally, communities is a reference to a stakeholder. So the people who are affected by the company's operations, the company's employee base, company supply chain. And one of the origin activities about, like I mentioned, grant making, that's sort of the first thought that people have when it comes to communities. So this was 2018, so it's already outdated. It only says diversity. It doesn't mention equity, inclusion, justice, or belonging, but diversity in terms of the actions that companies are taking to reverse inequities, to think about employees and, customers and communities from an equity or an inclusion lens, like what actions should we do in those areas, and then human rights. So living up to global standards, and also being aware of, at the baseline, if there are violations of human rights anywhere connected to the company's operations. And then on the inside of the company, this is about diversity, equity, and inclusion for employees. Health and safety is also like something companies have really tracked forever, but it is a social issue. Is the company keeping its people safe and healthy? Labor relations, can employees unionize? And then training, also an older issue, but really, I would say even more prominent right now with upskilling and automation. So an old issue renewed in attention. And the reason that I pulled this out is because I mentioned sort of picking a specialization in S and ESG or social issues. And this is one way that some people specialize. They just specialize on human rights. What do companies need to do within human rights? Of course, there's lots of work right now in diversity, equity, and inclusion, but all of these, I think, present opportunities. And then specifically, if you're interested in data, if you have sort of a quant lean to your skill set and what you like to do, looking at metrics in ESG is something that I think is going to be, it still needs to evolve, as I said, but there's a lot of excitement there on making things better based on the data that's out there now. So I'm always sort of looking for like, where is this list? I want a list of all the S and ESG metrics, and it doesn't really exist. Every investor platform has on their back end, not published, but like what data do they collect in this category? If you go to any company's public reporting, you can see they often have a data table in the back of their report. You can look and see what they've chosen to report. But one source which is publicly available is GRI, the Global Reporting Initiative. You can download that full set of standards, and topic by topic, you can pull things up. And I just pulled up training and education. It doesn't always suggest that companies use data to report on every single topic, but training and education is one. And I even put the specific example there just in case anyone was curious. They suggest companies report the average hours of training per employee and have that broken down by category in reference to like hierarchy and gender. So this is one place companies go. They consider it guidance, not GRI isn't a regulator, but it definitely has market share in terms of where people are looking to say like, well, what data do you want to see from me if this issue is material or critical to my company? And to go and to Eve's question about supporting culture in the arts. So within communities, I would say that's where arts and culture would fall. That I think shows up a few different ways. So companies, grant making is one piece of it. Employee volunteering is another piece of it. And then the idea of offering time and corporate matches for employee donations is also a reference to the fact that when it comes to communities, they want their employees to guide where those resources are going. So you may find that arts and culture are being addressed primarily through what the employees are driving in the communities area. And the reason for that is that so many companies, maybe 10 years ago, said our community work needs to be aligned with our business expertise, our business priorities, what's relevant to us as a business. So for most large corporations, arts and culture, the slice of the pie quickly shrunk. I'm trying to think of companies where that wouldn't be true. Like I bet Etsy might be one that's still allocating a fair amount towards arts and culture. There's probably others, but the idea is that the strategic nature of community engagement meant sort of a shrinking of at least resources for like grants and employee time dedicated from the company. Okay, so then I just wanted to show a few examples of how S and ESG data shows up in companies reporting. So Campbell's, they're one company that I have worked with in the past on an engagement while at CCP. And the reason that I pulled them out is because this is community, so not their entire social reporting, but they've got a mix here of some high level data that is about the company and then about their community partners, which I think is a good sign. If it's only about the community partners, then they've sort of missed one piece of it, which is like, what is the company reporting about itself and its own data? So 70% of employees in community-based activities, that's their data about what they're doing. Food access for 100,000 residents and communities, that's definitely from their community partners reporting back to them. So I would say they're kind of like middle range, a little bit better than most in terms of how they report their community data. Another example is from JPMorgan Chase. This is a different issue, not communities, but more about equity and inclusion in their hiring and their demographic data. So I wouldn't call this the left side of this pretty standard. You'll see this in most every single report you probably have already, but calling out the fact that like one side of ESG skill sets is about like data visualization, analysis, all the kind of crunching and data cleansing that probably happened behind the scenes to get to these charts. And then on the right-hand side is about a company following up on its individual goals. So this is where my point about we need more time for companies to report individually before it's standardized comes out. So they're working on, let me pull something out here. They're hiring apprentices. They have an apprentice program, emerging talent. They're changing some requirements around some of these apprentice programs. It's all very individualized, you know, and so they're trying to figure out like how can we have the best impact. And so if they were forced into standardized metrics in their hiring practices, it actually might have created some friction to this experimentation of trying to, you know, do things differently in terms of how they're hiring. So I personally think that's a good thing. And then the bright shining star, an example besides Ben and Jerry's that is just constantly used is Unilever. And the reason I want to call them out in the metrics section is because they are to the level of reporting targets. So Campbell's, as you saw, was sort of like a report out on what had happened. But Unilever is stepping way beyond that and going as far as putting out where they want to go, specific numbers around it, and also not feeling pressured to have a number on everything. I love that they say accelerate diverse representation at all levels of leadership. I think that's smart because what they're doing in that case is probably doing a fairly complex, nuanced, and inclusive, hopefully, process of what does acceleration mean? And that is even better than just saying we need 15% diverse representation. We're going to do it no matter what. So those are three examples, each sort of offering a different view on what S and ESG metrics look like. Okay, so I saw a couple of questions pop up in here. Sandra, you can say it if you want to, I'll read it. Aside from reducing market risk, investors generally at all care about ESG. And do you think this would change at all if ESG disclosure was federally mandated? Which is, okay, so the behavior of investors over time would indicate that primarily they're motivated by profits. So you have to look at someone's behavior even more than what they say, but investors are not a monolith. They're all individual people. I have a couple of stocks, so I guess I'm an investor and I definitely care. Maybe some of you do as well. So to me, what the pressure kind of coming from inside companies about how they represent information is a counterbalance. It's not just about investment decisions, but you might even read articles about like shareholder resolutions. So shareholders bringing changes that they want to see at the company. So activism coming from inside the investment community, not just in how they're moving their money. So I think everybody cares about different things, wants their issues, you know, brought to the table. I think mandates have a role, you know, we can look around and see that things have not moved fastly enough. Many of us would probably agree. So regulation and mandates can have major pressure. And likewise, the CEO voice and the, you know, who are CEOs talking to most frequently, their board of director and investors. And to me, what investors are asking CEOs is one of the, you know, we couldn't quantify the effect of that, but it's huge in terms of the decisions that they're making on a day-to-day basis. And are they factoring in something other than profits, quarterly earnings? So I think mandates have a role, but they're not going to be it because my perspective is skewed towards large companies, not small and medium-sized enterprises, but the resource availability to work around regulations and mandates is there. So it's also about a lot of different forces from a lot of different sectors putting pressure. I mentioned employee pressure, which to me is one that is huge right now. And you need all of it, I guess, is a short way to give what my point of view is. Lindsay, that's a great question. And actually, it's a great segue to my last and final slide, which is my last bullet is on supply chain. So thinking about careers, I mentioned I'm a big fan of Project Drawdown. One of the papers that they published over the past year is called Every Job is a Climate Job. And I think that even for myself, who wanted a career in social impact, looking at how different jobs are done, what resources you control, no matter what role you're in, I think is really significant and a really important mind shift. So supply chain is huge. In my experience, looking at when there is social impact innovation that has huge results, it's when companies are looking at their supply chain. It usually has a sort of like a spark in philanthropy and grant making, but it goes beyond it. So one program, which I'm not going to remember the name of, but it was by Gap. So their supply chain identified issues in factories where they were manufacturing their products. They were following regulation, so there were no laws being broken, but just the standards that Gap wanted to have within their supply chain said that they wanted to do something more. And it wasn't a philanthropic program. So they were hiring companies to offer access to different healthcare services, provide counseling, support childcare. So there was all these sort of like wraparound supports for the employees that are connected to social issues, but it wasn't grant making. It was sort of like also feeding the local economy because of how they were bringing those services to the people working inside the factory and their supply chain. So that may or may not have been what you were referring to, Lindsay, but I feel like the choices made in supply chain and vendor management are really significant, especially for large companies, because it's such a huge slice of their budget. Are you about to unmute? Do you have anything you want to add?
No, yeah, it does seem that that's, and how far companies are willing to delve, it's, I imagine in some cases it might be like opening a lid you might not want to see, like, does the fruit in your jam come from, some exploitation in some, or your chocolate, that kind of stuff. I guess another related issue is just a perverse effect of some of the ESG. I've seen some companies like following the letter, but not the intent, like getting stuff off their books. Like there was a story recently about Shell, I think it was Shell, getting like their dirtiest oil fields off their books, but they were just selling them to other investors. So, I mean, I guess in the end, like it really depends on the will and internally, right, of the leadership. But like, are they going to really take this to heart, or are they just gonna like, do it cynically? Yeah, and there's really, it's really up to the consumer or the standards setting bodies to distinguish what's actually going on.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I think like I remain optimistic against all odds, because I think that in the majority of people, right decisions are made, and then the way that the power balances are right now, those with assets, those with positions of authority, that power balance is a little bit off, and it's just going to take time, like lots of time. Things have gotten better than they were. Things are more transparent than they've ever been. We're staring directly at incredibly complicated and impossible and harrowing issues, but we're looking at them more directly. And to me, there's always a sign for something kind of moving in the right direction. I think the incentives for companies are, this is my opinion, are off. I could send Suzanne and Sam this massive paper about the pros and cons of stakeholder capitalism and how it won't work and how it will work. So there's people on all sides. And I think like finding the slice where I want to contribute, and you're all probably finding the slice where you want to contribute towards the right direction is where I take optimism. So the things I just wanted to say about like roles and hiring trends, I'll just kind of toss a few things out, are that just to be conscious if you ever see a company combining social impact and diversity, equity, and inclusion. That's too much for one role, in my opinion. And it's a signal to you both about how they think about their social impact and about how they think about their diversity, equity, and inclusion. So look one step further about the intentions of the company and how they're managing their practice, essentially. I already talked a lot about reporting and data, but if that is a direction that interests you, I know a lot of former colleagues who've gotten SASB certifications as sort of one way to kind of build credibility in that space. If I was job hunting right now, I would look at the organizations that got funded by Mackenzie Scott. I don't know if anyone has said that before, but I feel like when you know, the second point is related to that, like huge increases in funding are inevitably going to lead to hiring in the social sector because human capital is the main capital. Funding rounds, these will be a little bit harder to find, but Benevity is one software company, Matheson is one company that just had these massive funding rounds, and inevitably I think will lead to hiring. I think also communications and PR, I see a lot of roles in that direction, and there's certain firms that just are oriented towards communications and PR, which has sort of a social issue direction. I've even seen companies who are using their PR firm to do their like strategy, not just their reporting on social impact. So there's opportunities there to kind of like get your hands on some of the levers of power. Porter Novelli is really big. McPherson Strategies is, I think, like 11 or 12 staff. So there's a whole range out there. And then, as we were just talking about, I think, you know, picking a specialization, I think supply chain, vendor management is an area that most companies find sort of difficult to hire for. And it has a really big impact because it's directly connected to so many different budget lines, and how the company spends its money is one of its major sources of power. And then a quick screenshot on the right. So I believe all realized worth webinars are free. So they're having one. I just saw this and I thought I'd drop it on this slide for today. Realized Worth is known years ago primarily for employee engagement and volunteering consulting, but they do a lot more, and I think are pretty innovative in my opinion. So if anybody's interested in that direction, you could. This is a very unhelpful way to share this webinar because it's a little screenshot and not the link, but maybe I can share the link afterwards and people can take a look if they're interested in that. That's everything that I wanted to say. So I'm certainly happy to answer any other questions. I don't know if there's any more questions, comments, discussion that anybody would like to have.
Can you guys see me?
Yep.
Okay, thank you. Just one quick question.
Go for it.
Yes. Do you think this ESG going to have a great impact on this global warming craze that is so popular nowadays? What is your observation on that? Its impact on because I think global warming is definitely one of the major factors now that we're facing. That it's getting worse and it's getting worse. What is your opinion on that?
My opinion is that that's the topic where I believe that the regulation is going to have a really great effect. And the reason is that climate reporting, we know how to do it. So there's so many experts out there. I'll go back to this one here. I don't want to mess up the TCFD. And so many others, but they're the one that comes to mind. Oh, CDP and TCFD, the two of them they've figured it out. They know how to do this. And companies have also chosen to sort of report their information in a way that is too highly influenced, in my opinion, on the narrative. So they want to say there was a moment in time when every company was announcing by what year they would be net zero. but they need to be at zero, right? We don't need net zero because trying to buy offsets or, all kinds of sort of mathematical ways to report a certain outcome without actually achieving it. So I would say regulation is really big right there. And then likewise, my background is in social impact. So I've seen how companies can activate employees on volunteering and giving. And I think when it comes to climate, something I get really excited about is not just having similar, what would you call it, incentives for employees around taking new actions, but helping employees focus. So Project Drawdown talks about like plant-based diets and if nothing else, reducing beef in our diets. And if a company could track that and really influence behavior of a massive slice of people, which are their employees. So I would say that those are two things that come to mind when I think about like how what is called the ESG fields can have some effect on reducing the human effects on the climate.
Excellent. Thank you.
Anybody else?
Carmen, just one more question. Are there any other, you recommended that news site and Suzanne also put the CSR monitor in the chat. Are there any other people who study or critique or provide interesting, commentary on the sector? Well, you obviously, but others that you would recommend that we follow?
I think Green Biz is another place that has a lot of good writers and they sort of curate some really interesting information. If you lean in the direction of the investor conversation, Financial Times has just started ESG Connect or something. So it's like a subgroup of all of their other articles. And then what I do is I really am careful to curate specific people on LinkedIn so that I can see what's being published out there and be able to like see the best articles and see what's latest. But the other thing that I do is I keep a running list of organizations like Just Capital, and I go straight to their website or someplace their LinkedIn posts or something, like a place where they're curating their content, and just read what they're up to. So that, I think I mention it because I think it's important to decide what you want to look at. So if you're particularly interested in arts and culture, you might have like a top 10 list of who you think is good, and you just check their website once every 6 months to see what they're posting about. So those are my comments. I see a hand raised.
Yeah, this is Shenjie. I have a question. Excuse me. How do you think is the best way to evaluate the governance, build up?
The governance of the company?
Yeah, to quantitatively evaluate the governance.
It's a good question. I do believe that I think demographic data has potentials for flaws in a lot of cases, but when it comes to a board of directors making decisions, some representation of the demographic breakdown of who's on the board, I believe, is still important. And that is something that can be quantified as long as the board is willing to self-identify. So that's one piece of it. This one is less quantitative, but I'm thinking about which metrics would I look at to say whether or not this was actually happening. But it's about what I personally think is the best sign of strong governance is about the board's ability to respond, especially over the last 2-3 years. So how much are they facilitating an evolution to decision making? And that might be represented by number of shareholder resolutions passed. It might be represented by changes in employee satisfaction. They might have something that they can use to sort of indicate whether or not they're evolving their strategy and decision-making based on what they're hearing and what they're learning that's happening in the world. But to me, that would be the counterbalances to what primarily I think is used to judge governance, which is, do we continue to be profitable? Do we continue to grow? And that's where I think you can, unfortunately, in some cases, cover up where social issues or environmental issues might not be being addressed. So Shenji, I do not have a extremely specific answer for you, but you've got me thinking now.
Very good point. Thank you very much, Carmen.
Carmen, you had an event on June 28th on one of your slides. Is that an event you'd recommend? Yeah, this Realized Worth one.
Realized Worth, I've been to a couple of theirs. I know the people who run the organization, and I think that they're great. I would say they're innovative. They lean, as I said, in the direction of, so years ago, I think they were fairly focused on employee volunteering, so like employee activation. I think they've expanded since then. But it's just, yeah, it's a thought of a place. There might be, you might make a new connection. And they are definitely active. And they're more innovative, I think. They're a little bit more, on the cutting edge. Willing to try to push the conversation. That's awesome. Well, it's fine if there's no more questions. Thanks everybody for, oh, and she found it, amazing. So it's right there in the chat now. So thanks everybody. And thanks for having me.
Yeah, please join me in thanking Carmen Perez for this wonderful presentation. I certainly learned a lot. If folks want to, oh, I see your contact info, perfect. I was gonna say if anyone has a question they think of later, and are you open to people at this event linking in with you?
Of course.
Okay, great.
I would love that.
Well, thanks again. We appreciate it so much. We hope to do something else with you maybe in the future, bring you back. So we'll keep in touch with you. Thanks everyone for being here. Have a great rest of your day.
Thanks everyone. Have a great day.
Thank you.